Let's start with something uncomfortable. Most new ideas don't fail because they're bad. They fail because people never give them a real chance. That sounds obvious, but think about it. How many times have you heard someone say, "Yeah, I tried it for a bit, it just wasn't for me"? Not, "it didn't work," not, "it was broken," just, "it wasn't for me." That phrase usually means one thing. It felt unfamiliar. And unfamiliar feels risky. Humans don't reject new ideas because we hate progress. We reject them because our brains are built to protect us. When something looks new, our first instinct isn't curiosity, it's caution. Is this safe? Is this legit? Am I going to look stupid if I try this? Those questions happen automatically before logic kicks in. And that's where most new ideas die. Not at the quality stage, not at the usefulness stage. They die at the entrance. Think about walking into a room you've never been in before. You don't relax immediately. You scan. You look for familiar signs. Where's the exit? Who's in charge here? What's the tone? Only after that do you decide how to behave. Ideas work the same way. Before people engage with what you're saying, they're checking whether the situation feels recognizable. And if it doesn't, they pull back. This is why truly new things almost never succeed on their own. They need a bridge. But most creators, founders, and thinkers make the same mistake. They focus entirely on the idea itself. They polish it, they improve it, they perfect it, and then they present it naked. No context, no familiar frame, no soft landing. Just, "Here's something new, trust me." That's a hard ask. Especially today. People are overloaded. Everyone is selling something. Everyone claims to be different. So when something actually is different, it gets punished for it. Let me give you a simple example. Imagine you're scrolling online. You see two videos. One says, "An entirely new way to think about work." The other says, "What most people get wrong about work-life balance." Same depth, same intelligence. Which one feels safer to click? Probably the second one. Not because it's better, but because you already know where it fits. Your brain can place it, and placement equals comfort. This is also why people often resist advice even when it's good. If advice doesn't sound like something they've heard before, it feels suspicious, too clean, too confident, too unfamiliar, so they dismiss it before testing it. What's ironic is that people say they want new ideas. They say they want originality. They say they're bored of the same old things. But behavior tells a different story. People want new outcomes, delivered through familiar shapes. That's the part most people miss. Look at almost any successful shift in culture, tech, or media. It rarely arrives announcing itself as a revolution. It sneaks in, wrapped in something people already understand. That's not deception, that's translation. Because raw novelty is expensive. It costs attention, it costs trust, it costs emotional energy. And most people don't have much of that left. So when something shows up that demands all three at once, it gets rejected by default. Now here's the uncomfortable question. If new ideas fail at the entrance, is the problem really the idea, or is it the way it's introduced? Most people blame the audience. They just don't get it. They're not ready. They're stuck in old thinking. That might feel good to say, but it doesn't help. Because if your goal is to be understood, you have to meet people where they are. And where they are is surrounded by familiar patterns, familiar words, familiar formats, familiar expectations. That doesn't mean dumbing things down. It means anchoring them. Think of it like this. If you want someone to cross a river, you don't yell instructions from the other side. You build a bridge. And bridges don't look exciting. They look stable. They borrow from what people already trust. Only once someone is on the bridge are they willing to move forward. Ideas are the same way. Before someone adopts a new way of thinking, they need to feel grounded. They need to recognize the structure. Without that, even the best idea feels like a risk they don't need to take. So when something new fails, it's often not because it's wrong. It's because it showed up alone. No context, no familiar shape, no invitation. And the truth is, people don't reject new ideas. They reject feeling lost.
Let's pause for a second and talk about something that feels obvious, but almost everyone underestimates. When people get fooled, manipulated, or quietly guided into a decision, it's usually not because the idea was brilliant. It's because the shape of the idea felt familiar. Humans don't evaluate information in a vacuum. We don't ask, is this objectively true? We ask, without realizing it, does this look like something I already trust? That question runs faster than logic, much faster. Think about it. If a stranger walks up to you on the street and starts giving financial advice, your guard is up instantly. But if the same advice comes wrapped inside a news report, a friend's recommendation, or a professional presentation, your brain relaxes before you even hear the words. Same content, totally different reaction. This is where the real power of strategy lives, not in what you say, but in how it arrives. And this idea is much older than social media, marketing funnels, or modern politics. Ancient strategists understood something very simple. People don't resist messages, they resist foreign shapes. If something looks like it belongs, it slides in. If it looks unfamiliar, even a good idea gets rejected. That's why disguise doesn't always mean hiding. Sometimes it means dressing something new in old clothes. Look at how scams actually work. The most effective scams are rarely complicated. They don't overwhelm you with genius-level lies. They copy something you've already seen before. A bank email that looks exactly like your bank. A login page that feels identical to the real one. A message that uses the same tone, spacing, and language your company uses internally. Your brain doesn't analyze it deeply because it recognizes the form. Recognition creates trust. Trust opens the door. And once that door is open, the content barely has to try. This doesn't only apply to scams, it applies to persuasion, influence, and even everyday communication. If you present a radical idea using a familiar format, people listen. If you present a reasonable idea in an unfamiliar form, people push back. That's why new ideas are often introduced as updates, extensions, or improvements instead of revolutions. Same change, different packaging. Your mind hears update and thinks safe. It hears revolution and thinks risk. Now bring this back to strategy. One of the most dangerous mistakes people make is focusing all their energy on content, arguments, logic, facts, while ignoring the container. They assume if the idea is strong enough, it will win on its own. History says otherwise. Ideas rarely win by strength alone. They win by blending in. This is where familiarity becomes a weapon. If you want something to pass through defenses, you don't smash the wall. You send it through the gate wearing the right uniform. That uniform might be tradition. It might be authority. It might be routine. Sometimes it's just repetition. When people see the same structure again and again, they stop questioning it. The structure becomes invisible. And when structure is invisible, content gains power. That's why propaganda doesn't look strange. It looks boring. That's why effective persuasion often sounds dull. It uses phrases you've heard 1,000 times, not because they're clever, but because they're familiar. Your brain saves energy by trusting patterns it already knows. Now, here's the uncomfortable part. This mechanism doesn't care whether the intention is good or bad. The same principle can educate or deceive, protect or exploit. That's why understanding it matters. If you don't recognize familiar forms, you become vulnerable to them. If you do recognize them, you regain choice. Once you notice how often something says, "This is normal," before saying anything else, you can slow down. You can ask, am I trusting this because it makes sense or because it feels familiar? That single pause breaks the spell. And this connects directly to the strategy we're talking about. The real trick isn't to invent something shocking, it's to hide novelty inside routine, to let the guard down first, to let resistance relax. By the time the meaning arrives, the door is already open. That's why some of the most powerful moves in history didn't look aggressive at all. They looked polite. They looked reasonable. They looked exactly like what people were used to seeing. And that's what made them work. Because when form feels safe, content goes unquestioned. And once content goes unquestioned, control doesn't need force anymore. It just needs time.
Here's where things start to get uncomfortable. Because the strategy we're talking about doesn't look like a move at all. There's no attack, no confrontation, no dramatic action. On the surface, it looks like doing nothing. And that's exactly why it works. Most people are trained, socially, emotionally, even morally, to respect restraint. We admire patience. We praise calm. We trust people who don't rush. So when someone appears passive, we lower our guard. We assume there's no threat. But in strategy, stillness can be louder than action. This move works by exploiting one of the oldest assumptions in human thinking. If nothing is happening, nothing is being done. That assumption is wrong. Sometimes the most decisive move is refusing to move at all, at least visibly. Imagine two people in a conflict. One keeps reacting, explaining, correcting, defending. The other says almost nothing. Who looks stronger? Usually the quiet one. Silence creates space, and in that space, the other person starts filling the gaps. They talk more, they reveal more, they make mistakes. Not because they're foolish, but because humans hate uncertainty. When there's no clear signal, we create one ourselves. This strategy understands that deeply. Instead of pushing events forward, it lets events collapse inward. Instead of forcing outcomes, it waits for pressure to build on its own. Think about negotiations. The person who speaks first after an offer often loses leverage. Why? Because silence feels like resistance, even if it isn't. The other side starts second-guessing. Did I ask for too much? Are they unhappy? Should I adjust? Nothing changed externally, but internally, pressure exploded. That's the essence of this move. You don't need to dominate the board, you just need to stop interfering. People assume control requires constant action. In reality, control often comes from choosing when not to act. This is hard to accept because it feels counterintuitive. We're taught that influence means presence, that leadership means direction, that power means visibility. But this strategy uses absence. It lets others overextend, over-explain, over-commit. And while they're busy doing that, the situation shifts naturally. Not toward chaos, but toward exposure. Because when people move without resistance, they move too far. This move also relies on time. Time is uncomfortable. When nothing happens, people get nervous. They want resolution. They want closure. So they create it. They concede. They compromise. They reveal intentions. All because the other side stayed still. This is why the move is often misread as weakness. From the outside, it looks like hesitation, like indecision, like passivity. But internally, it's controlled restraint. You're not frozen, you're watching. You're letting the situation show you its structure. And once the structure is visible, action becomes easy. That's the trap people fall into when facing this strategy. They mistake calm for lack of capability. They mistake silence for ignorance. By the time they realize something is wrong, the balance has already shifted. Because the damage didn't come from an attack, it came from their own momentum. This strategy doesn't fight force with force. It lets force burn itself out. And that's why it's so dangerous. You can't react to it the usual way. You can't counter what you can't see. There's nothing to argue against, nothing to block, just nothing. And that nothing becomes unbearable. So people act. And in acting, they expose exactly what they were trying to protect. That's the move. Not loud, not heroic, not dramatic. Just patient, controlled stillness, while the other side defeats itself. Now, here's the part people usually skip. Because this move sounds elegant, almost too elegant, And that's exactly why it gets misused. Silence, restraint, and waiting can look powerful, but only under very specific conditions. Outside of those conditions, this strategy doesn't make you look calm. It makes you look irrelevant. There's a thin line between controlled stillness and losing presence. Cross that line and you're not playing a smart game anymore. You're just not in the game. The first mistake people make is waiting without leverage. Silence only works when the other side still needs you. If they don't, your silence isn't pressure, it's relief. If your absence doesn't create discomfort, it creates space for someone else. Another common mistake is confusing patience with avoidance. This strategy is not about dodging responsibility. It's not about hiding. It's not about refusing to engage forever. It's about timing. Waiting without intention isn't strategy. It's indecision. And people can feel that. Humans are incredibly good at sensing when someone is holding back on purpose versus when they simply have nothing to say. The energy is different. One feels grounded, the other feels empty. If your silence doesn't feel deliberate, it won't create pressure. It will create doubt. The third risk is overestimating how long others will tolerate uncertainty. Yes, people dislike ambiguity, but they don't tolerate it indefinitely. If nothing happens for too long, they stop caring. And once people stop caring, you've lost all influence. This is where many people get stuck. They think, if waiting works, more waiting must work even better. It doesn't. At some point, waiting turns into invisibility, and invisibility is the opposite of power. There's also a moral trap here, because this strategy can feel clever, too clever. Some people start using it everywhere, in relationships, at work, in conversations that actually need honesty. That's when it becomes manipulation. And manipulation eventually backfires. People may not know exactly what you're doing, but they'll feel that something is off. Trust erodes quietly. And once trust is gone, silence stops being strategic. It just becomes distance. This move only works when there's already a foundation, a shared context, a relationship, a reason for the other side to stay engaged. Without that, stillness is just absence. One more thing people misunderstand. This strategy is not passive. Internally, it's very active. You're observing, you're reading patterns, you're tracking shifts. If you're not doing that work, you're not using the strategy. You're just delaying. And delays don't magically turn into advantage. They turn into missed windows. The final mistake is ego. Some people enjoy the feeling of, I'm not reacting. It makes them feel superior, detached, above the situation. That's dangerous, because the moment this becomes about your identity, about looking calm, smart, or unbothered, you stop responding to reality. And reality doesn't care how composed you look. This move works when it's invisible. The moment you start admiring it, you've probably overplayed it. So yes, this strategy can shift outcomes without force, but only if you respect its limits. Stillness is a tool, not a personality. Use it precisely, use it briefly, and know exactly what you're waiting for. Otherwise, the silence you create won't pressure others. It will quietly erase you. So after all this, what's the real rule underneath? It's not about silence, it's not about waiting, and it's definitely not about doing nothing. It's about letting structure do the work. Most people try to force outcomes directly. They push, they argue, they explain, and they react. This approach does the opposite. Instead of fighting the system, it steps slightly out of the way. just enough for the system to reveal itself. Because every situation already has momentum. People already have incentives. Emotions are already moving. Pressure is already building somewhere. You don't need to create that. You just need to stop interfering with it. That's the part most people struggle with. They think influence means adding energy. Sometimes it means removing friction. When you don't rush to fill silence, others do. When you don't rush to explain, others assume. When you don't rush to act, others expose their urgency. Not because you tricked them, but because the situation demanded resolution. This is why this move feels almost unfair. You're not overpowering anyone, you're not outsmarting them in the moment, you're simply refusing to absorb pressure that doesn't belong to you. And pressure hates being ignored. It has to go somewhere. Usually, it goes back to the person who created it. That's the quiet shift. Nothing dramatic happens, no single moment stands out, but afterward, when people look back, they realize something changed. Decisions moved in your direction. Concessions appeared without being demanded. Opportunities opened without being chased. And it feels strange because you didn't do much. But you did something very specific. You chose timing over impulse. You chose structure over reaction. You trusted that not every moment needs your input. That's a hard lesson, especially in a world that rewards speed, visibility, and constant engagement. But the people who understand this rule don't disappear. They become harder to push, harder to rush, harder to corner. Not because they're aggressive, but because they don't panic when things slow down. And that calm changes the entire balance. So if there's one takeaway here, it's this. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits quietly while everything else moves around it. And by the time the dust settles, it's already standing in the best position.